Hey guys, welcome to the weekly movie recommendations with Sanket. So for today's episode, I have invited a very special guest. His name is Mike McCahill. So Mike is a very famous film critic, and he works for newspapers like The Guardian and Daily Telegraph and magazines such as the Reader's Digest magazine. So for today's episode, he'll be recommending three feature films. So over to you, Mike.
Hi, Team Sanket. Hope you're well. I'm Mike McCahill, film critic for The Guardian. Thanks for inviting me into your little world. This is my little world. This is the bunker on Plague Island that I now reside in, while things are a little bit chaos and crazy outside. I'm here to give you three recommendations for movies. It might depend on what mood you're in, but let's see what we've got. If you're looking for feel good, frothy fun, I would point you in the direction of That Thing You Do, written and directed by Tom Hanks. Indeed, the only film to date that Tom Hanks has written and directed in his decades-long career. This is back from 1996. And it's an attempt to conjure up the spirit of pop music as was experienced by America in the days before the Beatles came to town and changed everything overnight. It attempts to do that through the experiences of one boy band known as the Wonders, spelt Oneders, which leads to all kinds of confusion. They become overnight sensations with their first single before submitting to the kind of struggles that a lot of bands go through in a final parting of the ways. There's an element of romantic comedy in it, in that Guy, our hero, the drummer in the band, played by Tom Everett Scott, falls for Faye, played by Liv Tyler, who is the girlfriend of the lead guitarist, played by Jonathan Shage. And I think any film that came out around 1997 that had Liv Tyler in it was bound to have my heart sooner or later. But also beyond that, I think it has a really good sense of the music business and the entertainment industry as it was in the early 1960s. Hanks himself turns up in a cameo as the record label executive, the executive from Playtone Records, who signs the band and has a little bit of input in their image and the way they make themselves over. I think if there's one reason why you should see it, it would be the songs which have been written by Adam Schlesinger, who was the frontman of the American power pop band Fountains of Wayne. Sadly, we lost him to COVID last year. He died very early on in March 2020. And you'll get a sense very much for what we lost when you're watching that film, because the songs are just, they have to work in order to drive the narrative forward, and they are these perfect pastiche early 1960s pop songs. They're almost too good, actually, for a lot of those garage rock bands that were doing the rounds at the time. But they are spot on as pastiches of that kind of sound. I guarantee you will have the title song of That Thing You Do in your head for days after you've watched it. If you're in the market for thrills and spills, on the other hand, a real gem that I think has sort of slipped under the radar a little bit, Run Lola Run, by Tom Tykwer, the German writer-director. Tom Tykwer was a director who was never quite matched this initial burst of promise. He went on to work with the Wachowskis on Cloud Atlas and on their Netflix show Sense8. He went off and had a good deal of success in TV on his own with Babylon Berlin, which has been a big streaming hit recently. But this was towards the beginning of his career, 1999, and it sort of proves out the old saying that Jean-Luc Godard put forward when he said all you need to make a movie is a girl and a gun, because essentially those are the key elements of Run Lola Run. It's the story of Lola, played by Frank Potente, who you'll probably remember from the first Born movie. She turned up in that. And Lola gets a call out of the blue from her boyfriend, who wants her to bring a bag of cash to him. He only has 20 minutes to get his hands on it, otherwise he's dead. It's all over. So Lola does what Lola does. She runs. She runs across Berlin to get to him, and if at first she fails, she tries again. And that takes the film into the areas of Groundhog Day and a little bit of those time travel movies where we're seeing the same narrative played out in different ways. Every time she fails, we go back to the start. We start again, and Lola runs again. There's an element of gaming about it. I think it's possibly the best film that's ever been made that feels like a computer game that hasn't been made, that doesn't exist. And there's an element of gimmickry in there. But for me, there's always, that gimmickry has been backed up by real cinematic heft and flair. Tom Tykwer knows how to put images and sound together. There's a brilliant techno score by McCahill, who've worked on a number of Tom Tykwer's films. The editing is super sharp. I mean, it's a really restless film. It's constantly in motion. And it's always setting up these different narratives and avenues for itself as the film goes on. Lola takes a turn in one segment that she doesn't in another, and that changes things. There's an element of string theory going on, that thing where, a butterfly flaps its wings here and then there's a tsunami somewhere else. And somehow Tom Tykwer managed to resolve all of this in the course of just under 80 minutes. It is a film that is operating at somewhere close to the speed of light and sound. I had a crazy idea of putting this film on in 3 cinemas in one city and having the audiences run from one cinema to another to see different parts of the film. I think for health and safety reasons that idea was shouted down and never came to fruition. But maybe someday when all the chaos is over, we'll get to put on Run Lola Run in cinemas and have audiences running and huffing and puffing from one cinema to another. I don't know. In terms of to bring things right up to the present day, I want to talk a little bit about the best film, or one of the best films that I saw in 2020, which is Bloody Nose Empty Pockets, by the sibling filmmakers Bill and Turner Ross. This is an American indie film. It's often been sold to audiences as a documentary, in that Bill and Turner Ross went and sat in a bar in Las Vegas on the very final day of that bar before it closed down. And over the course of the day, they watched very patiently, very quietly, the customers come into the bar, take their stools. Some of them don't have work to go to. Some of them just come from work, and then just proceed to get very, very drunk, as people do in bars. There is a little bit of cheating going on with this film, which I think if you read around a little bit, either before or after you've seen the film, you'll see where the Ross brothers cheated a little bit. But what it gets, I think, is that ambience of a dive bar during a very long and very boozy and very unrestrained session of drinking. And the way that drinking brings out the humanity of all people, all parties involved. These great characters come into frame. There's Michael, who's an actor and a writer, who's the sort of source of the wit and wisdom during the session. He's one of these guys who, despite all the copious drinking that's going on, he manages to stay relatively sane and sober and come up with some useful life advice for many of the younger drinkers around him. There's an Australian who sits at the bar through the entirety of the day, stopping only at one point to take his trousers off, because apparently that's what Australians in bars do. The framing is a little bit tricky and tricksy, and like I say, it might be best to read up on the film after you've seen it and see how that affects your viewing of the film. But I think in the course of its hour and a half, it does bring out these great truths about companionship and about the desperation of people who might have time on their hands to spend their afternoons and their evenings drinking in a place such as this. It was a great film to watch in 2020, when, of course, so many of our cafes and bars and restaurants were closed for one reason or another. Biggest reason, obviously, being coronavirus. It was this film that sort of showed me what I was missing, that kind of companionship and bonhomie, and just sitting in a corner with someone and having a conversation in a public place, and feeling safe enough to do that. And it's also a reminder, I think, of what's waiting for us when these vaccines eventually get out, and hopefully life can go back to something a bit more like normal. So, 3 films there. Hopefully, an enjoyable night or two while we wait for life to return to something like normal. I want to say thank you very much for having me on. It's been an absolute honour. I hope those films live up to my billing. In the meantime, stay safe, everybody, and hope to see you soon.